What's up, everybody? Dave here, and today we got a philosophical smackdown between Plato and Kant. Who's the better philosopher? Whose works were more important? Who should you read first if you've never read either of them? I'm going to give you my take today on Deadbeat philosophy. Plato and Kant, both incredibly influential, important figures in their own right. Most people who study philosophy encounter them in some ways. They both wrote on a number of different subjects. They actually have a lot in common, but let's first start with the contrast. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher, born and died in Athens, although he traveled around the Mediterranean during his life. He lived between the 5th and the 4th century BCE. He founded the academy, sort of started the whole academic trend and trajectory in global, or at least Western culture. Plato was the mentor of Aristotle, and Plato himself had been mentored by Socrates in a certain sense. They stand in that lineage with one another. Plato wrote a lot of texts, mostly dialogues. That's texts between different interlocutors, speakers who talk to one another and engage in intense philosophical discussion. Today we have most of Plato's texts, which is pretty remarkable for an ancient author. Also important about Plato is Plato's relationship with Socrates. So I mentioned Socrates was Plato's mentor. Socrates is also Plato's main character. In most of Plato's texts and most of Plato's dialogues, including the Phaedo and the Republic that I have here, Socrates is present in the center of the conversations, asking questions, responding to questions, having dialogue, meeting different figures in different contexts. So it's very interesting when you think about Plato and Socrates, they're actually very closely together. Kant lived in the 18th century in what was then Prussia and is now actually Russia. His city was called Königsberg, now it's Kaliningrad. He wrote in Latin and then in German and innovated philosophy in the German language in a very important way. Wrote on both theoretical topics, like about the nature of the world and how humans understand things. His most famous work from that branch is the Critique of Pure Reason. But also, Kant was incredibly influential, maybe even more influential if you want to just think in the broadest sense, in the realm of ethics and politics and practical philosophy. So Kant's best known work in that regard is the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But Kant, also an Enlightenment dude. He innovated the whole concept of enlightenment. He had an influential essay, What is Enlightenment?, that defined enlightenment as thinking for yourself, emerging out of your state of self-incurred immaturity into a sort of adulthood, as it were. Kant celebrated reason. Reason was at the center of Kant's mature philosophy. Kant was active for over 50 years, was thinking things, constantly changing his mind. He never had a family. We don't know if he had any romantic relationships. He did have close friendships, but he devoted himself to philosophy and to his studies and to writing and lecturing. He was a very influential lecturer, kind of like Plato. That's maybe a similarity. They both had many students. They were both popular amongst their students, and they both innovated different methods of teaching. So in addition to epistemology and theoretical philosophy and ethics and practical philosophy, Kant also made enormous contributions to anthropology and theories of human nature and philosophy of religion and aesthetics, philosophical logic, philosophy of language in its early form. Basically, any sub-area within philosophy after Kant was shaped by Kant in some way. All right, here's the smackdown part. Plato versus Kant. These are probably their most influential, biggest books. Plato's Republic, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, both classic canonical texts, both, in a certain sense, hard to critique just insofar as they're seen as these shining examples of philosophy in the Western mode. But which one's better? Well, the Republic has to do with politics, has to do with the city, the state, the citizen. It also has to do with knowledge and a lot of other human activities within that. But if you're especially interested in political matters and in questions of individual identity and the place of the individual in society, Plato's Republic is the one for you. And also, like whether the art should be in the city. There's some wild ideas in here. I'm just going to give you two. One, Plato excludes poetry from the city. So he thinks the best kind of cities don't have poetry. That's interesting for us to consider. You think of Sappho over on her island doing her poetry there, kind of in exile. But also, Plato in this text endorses this idea of collective child rearing. So basically, the idea is that the ideal city-state for Plato would be one where all parents give up their children at birth, and those children are raised by the group, not by individual parents. And there's a sort of collective identity and ownership and stewardship of the educational process. And that's a really radical idea. And I think I've always liked thinking about that since I, first heard about that. It's pretty wild. Whether that would be good or not, is that a utopia or a dystopia for you? Good question. On the other hand, we have Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So this is like one of the shining works of modern theoretical philosophy, epistemology. Kant here introduces what's known as his critical philosophy, makes this critical turn, introduces a new notion of reason and human understanding and a new sort of picture of what cognition is, if you want to put it that way, and focusing on the relationship of the human's faculties to the natural world and to sensory input, and breaking down the relationship between different faculties and making an argument that it is possible to, through our faculties, have genuine scientific knowledge of outside objects, or to have, in more technical Kantian terms, to have synthetic a priori judgments. We can make those about objects. I think that's how it goes. But there's a bunch of stuff in here, just this whole new vision of the human, not just the human, but the rational mind, really presaged not just, like modern philosophical approaches to thinking, logic, cognition, and conceptuality, but early psychology, approaches to cognition in a systematic sort of way. Many people say that after this text, there's a sort of Kantian turn in all of Western philosophy, at least in the areas of Kant's influence, that Kant put this certain answer or perspective or proposal on the table, and that after Kant, you couldn't but respond to it. You had to form a response. Whether that's true or not, is that overinflating Kant's influence? It depends on how you read the unfolding of the history of philosophy. But it's important also to note that Kant himself would stay true to the ideas in this book over the coming 2 decades of his life. So he was already quite old when this book appeared. So he was born in 1724. This came out in 81. So what does that make him? Almost 60. Kant was some people say he was a late bloomer, but that just means that he became very popular later in his life. And this book is really what catapulted him back onto the scene. He was already known before that. He had published a number of books on aesthetics, on the cosmos. He was known for his rhetoric. He had already introduced anthropology as a discipline prior to this, but when this came out, it really put Kant on the international radar. And after this text, Kant became like a celebrity in European intellectual life. He became, at the peak of his career, this is an interesting fact, the most highly paid professor in all of Prussia. So he had a direct and somewhat fractious but still close relationship with both the kings. I think it was Frederick the Great, and then Frederick's son, who's also called Frederick, who took over during Kant's lifetime as well. But even though Kant was at one point censored for his radical views, what we're seen as, or let's say, unorthodox views on religion and the relationship between religion and reason, Kant's view, in brackets here, is that religion should always answer to reason, and that reason is sort of where the buck stops. So you could see or imagine the sense in which that's a bit controversial. And he even defines in that phase of his work God as an idea of reason. So Kant's a real interesting figure. And in this text, this is the one that I read as an undergrad. Now people often read other ones, but I love the cover of it. He really digs into detail about all that. And the idea of, the synthetic a priori, of the antinomies, of there's just a bunch of concepts and framings and sort of set pieces that are in this book that are very interesting. It's a difficult read. Plato's Republic is definitely the better read if you're interested just in some bedtime reading, or you actually want to, let's say, get some joy out of reading, or read it with a group of other people. Probably the Republic's the way to go. But this text also worth grinding your teeth into, worth thinking about, and worth having on your bookshelf. Smackdown, which text better? I'm going to go with the Republic. So you can't outshine the Republic. Better readability. And the range of theories and ideas that are covered here in political philosophy, but also theories of knowledge and identity, human nature, and there's a bunch of stuff that I didn't even address. It's just a very sweeping, scoping work. So, sorry, critique of pure reason. Republic wins. Smackdown number 2. We got here Plato's Phaedo and Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals. This translation said, sometimes it's translated Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. So let's take a look at these two texts. Which one would win? Which one is better? So first, Plato's Phaedo. This is like my favorite Plato text because it's very dramatic. This is where Socrates dies. I mean, can it get more dramatic than that? There's not a Plato text where Socrates is born. I told you before how Socrates is like Plato's main character. In most of Plato's dialogue, Socrates features in a speaking role that's predominant, and also often an argumentative or logical role that's dominant. So Socrates sort of is the eyes or the philosophical mind through which Plato explores these philosophical issues. That's important to think because Plato's earlier works are often seen to be more reflective of the historical Socrates. So if you want to understand what Socrates was about or thought and not what Plato himself came to think, because there is a difference, then look at Plato's earlier works, the Apology, the Euthyphro, and others. But if you want to see what Plato's own thinking was about, that is to say, how Plato developed ideas that went above and beyond, or at least extended out apart from the ideas that his mentor Socrates had, then look at Plato's middle or late works. And the Phaedo, like the Republic, which we talked about before, is one of these texts where we see that middle period Plato exploring his own ideas. But it's also very dramatic with Socrates dying, Socrates given poison by the city of Athens. So the story, which if you have followed Socrates, it's maybe worth looking into. It's just a real interesting story. So Socrates was kind of like a gadfly. He was, by this point, well known. Imagine him in old age. He already had a big reputation as kind of an asshole, but also like a smart asshole that people like being around. He was a stone cutter, and he had a family. His partner, his wife, Xanthippe, and he had several children. But apparently he wasn't as close to them as he was to his male friends, and he mostly hung out with other males and talked with other males. That's an important thing to note with regards to these Platonic dialogues, although not exclusively. He was controversial, and he, in the city of Athens, came to be seen as a threat to public morality, and there was a sort of moral panic around Socrates, in particular his relationship to the children and to young people, and what sort of ideas Socrates might be planting into these young people's heads about society and about the gods in particular, and about, so he was accused of a sort of blasphemy, corrupting of the children, which carried with it a sentence of death. But Socrates had powerful friends, and it's clear from the context that he could have escaped. And in the dialogue, the Credo, I believe it's the Credo, yes, we see Socrates in prison offer the opportunity to escape, but turning the opportunity down on grounds of principle. So that comes to a head in the Phaedo, where Socrates actually dies. He stays in prison. He accepts his punishment, and he, at the end, drinks the hemlock poison, which has been prepared for him, and he dies. And that's how it goes. So this is an incredible text just on dramatic lines. And if you know the broader story, it's like it's like the Return of the Jedi of Plato, or of Socrates' lifespan. So it's also a text about death and dying. It's a text about the soul and the fear we have about death and our ideas of ourselves, both material and immaterial, and the question of what of ourselves, if anything, lives on past death, and really directly focuses on that fear of death, and in particular, Socrates' his friends who were there in the cell with him as he's drinking the poison, as he's talking about why he's going to drink the poison, as he's settling his, kind of accounts and saying his goodbyes, as it were. It's all those friends who are around him. They're very afraid. So Socrates himself is not afraid, consistent with his own philosophy, but they're all afraid. They're afraid for him and they're afraid for themselves. So Socrates in this text then spends his final hours talking about all this with his friends, proposing different ideas, different hypotheses, and moving on. It's really interesting in that regard as well. And I think that if, like me, you're interested in questions about death and mortality and finitude and these sort of things, it's a wonderful text. All right. Next, we got Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. Here, translated Groundwork of the Metaphysic of Morals. There's different ones. This was the first one I read, an older translation. I really like the cover as well, so I'm going to refer to this one. Kant wrote this in, 1785, published it in 1786. And this, like the Critique of Pure Reason that we talked about before, was Kant's first major entry point into ethics and moral philosophy. So he would go on to write multiple other texts in ethics, such as the Critique of Practical Reason, his second critique, and the Metaphysics of Morals, his final major moral philosophical work. But it was this book, which is much shorter than the other ones, much more compact, that had a direct influence in Kant's time, and then since has become incredibly influential and often assigned and often read. So maybe in college courses, it's very common for this to be read in a number of different contexts. The text is important because it's very theoretical, it's abstract, it's working at a level of laying a certain foundation for how we can even think about morals. So Kant's interested in morals and ethics and human action and the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do, and how we know what the right thing is and what the wrong thing is, and how can we trust our judgments about that, and how should we act in relationship to that. All of that's addressed in this text, and Kant makes some very influential arguments here. So just to point out a couple of these arguments, one involves the categorical imperative. So you may have heard about this. It's formulated in different ways here, but Kant's categorical imperative is basically every rational being must act as if its actions would be binding for all rational beings. And this is also stated something like, always treat the humanity in yourself never as a means, but always as an ends. I'll have to kind of correct myself with regards to that. But it's formed in a number of different ways. Some people compare it to the golden rule, basically this idea that you should act such that if your acts were generalized so that everybody did them, then you'd be okay with that. So do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. It's a sort of picture of moral reciprocity, and of when you're acting, you're not just acting alone, you're acting in concert with others in a fundamental way. And what it means to act morally for Kant is acting rationally. It's using your reason, and your reason is what binds you to other rational beings, including humans. But I always like pointing this out. Also, Kant was open to extraterrestrials who may be rational. So early in his career, he had an explicit theory that different planets in our solar system may, or likely did, he thought, have intelligent life. And intelligent life in the sense of having reason and ostensibly being ethical agents who we have duties towards. So Kant does restrict rational moral agency to human beings on the planet Earth. And so non-human animals, plants, artworks, robots, everything that's not a human being on the planet Earth is excluded from direct moral consideration in Kant. In some of my other work, I've addressed this, and I find that cut also very interesting and problematic. But in this text, Kant offers his best defense, his most influential defense of this fundamental idea around reason, moral action, and around also the goodwill, having a goodwill, the goodwill acting on intentions. That's the other idea. That being the only unconditionally good thing in the world. So thinking of this sort, this text has been very influential. It's also intellectually at the roots of modern human rights theory and let's say the UN Convention on Universal Human Rights, the idea that all humans have dignity, all rational beings, including human beings, must always be treated with respect, and their humanity ought to be respected. And we ought not to think of them just as means to accomplishing ends or to use them or instrumentalize them, but also always have them in mind and regard them as ends in themselves, that's worthy in their own right. So that idea, if you just kind of chew on that, you can sense how influential that was and remains. All right, Smackdown time. Plato's Phaedo or Kant's Groundwork. Which of these is the better philosophical text? Boom. I'm going to say Kant this time. So I love this text. This is like a very personal text. It's a great read, great story, highly recommendable. But just in terms of influence in our world and maybe importance, whether you agree with Kant's ideas or not, just the idea of full moral status for rational beings and of dignity and the defense of human personhood that's offered here seems more relevant than ever, even if these concepts are very fraught today and under threat today, and it's unclear how the future is going to play out with them. So I think this is the text that would win out, and that's what I got to say. So what's the result of our analysis? Boom, 2 texts. Maybe I'd say if you're going to check out Plato and Kant, do the Republic and the Groundwork, start with these, then build on out. Thanks, everybody. This has been a Philosophical Smackdown. We'll see you next time. Bye.